3 years ago, Julian Vandermeer threw his wife out of their penthouse with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart, replacing her with a mistress half her age. He told her she was worthless without his money. He told her she would disappear. He was wrong. Tonight, Julian walks into the most exclusive royal gala in Europe, gripping his mistress's waist, ready to flaunt his wealth to the elite. But as the music stops and the spotlight hits the grand staircase, Julian realizes his mistake. The royal hostess, the woman wearing the crown jewels everyone is bowing to, isn't a stranger. It's the wife he destroyed, and she hasn't just moved on. She's come to collect. The envelope arrived on a rainy Tuesday in London, delivered not by a standard courier, but by a man in a livery uniform, driving a matte black Bentley Mulsanne. He bypassed the reception of Vandermeer Holdings entirely, taking the private elevator to the 45th floor and placed the heavy cream card directly onto the mahogany desk of Julian Vandermeer. Julian, a man whose jawline was as sharp as his business practices, picked it up. The paper was textured, heavy, and smelled faintly of lavender and old money. Gold leaf embossed the edges. His Royal Highness, Prince Alistair of Valoria, requests the honor of your presence at the Grand Sapphire Gala, hosted by the Duchess of Solara at the Kensington Palace Orangery. Julian leaned back in his Herman Miller chair, a smirk curling his lips. He tossed the card toward the leather sofa, where Isabella, his current partner, was scrolling through Instagram. "We're in," Julian said, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "The Sapphire Gala. It's the most exclusive event of the season. Only the top 1% of the 1% get invited. CEOs, royals, old money." Isabella looked up, her eyes widening. She was 23, stunningly beautiful, in a way that required high maintenance, with hair dyed a platinum blonde that shimmered under the office lights. "The Sapphire Gala? Julian, that's huge. I heard the ticket price alone is £50,000. "Tickets are for peasants, Isabella," Julian corrected, standing up and buttoning his bespoke Brioni suit jacket. "I didn't buy a ticket. I was invited. It means my merger with the Titan Group has finally put me on the royal radar. This is it. This is the night I solidify my empire." He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the grey London skyline. 3 years. It had been 3 years since he had finalized the divorce from Serafina. He remembered that day with a cold detachment. Serafina, with her mousy brown hair and her practical clothes, crying in the foyer of their old house. She had begged him to work on the marriage. She had pleaded. "I supported you when you had nothing, Julian. We built this together," she had screamed. He had laughed then. "I built this, Serafina. You just existed in the background. You're holding me back. I need someone who fits the part of a billionaire's wife. You're just plain." He had given her a settlement that was insulting compared to his net worth. Thanks to a ruthless prenup, his lawyers had bullied her into signing years prior. She had left with practically nothing. He hadn't seen or heard from her since. Good riddance. "What should I wear?" Isabella asked, snapping him out of his reverie. She was already standing, checking her reflection in the glass. "It has to be something that screams, 'Future Mrs. Vandermeer.'" Julian turned to her, his eyes scanning her figure possessively. "Go to Harrods, the private shopping suite. Tell them to pull the red Alexander McQueen. I want you to look expensive. I want every man in that room to envy me, and every woman to hate you. We are going to walk into that palace and own the room." "And the host?" Isabella asked, looking at the invitation again. "The Duchess of Solara? I've never heard of her. Is she new?" Julian waved a hand dismissively. "Some European aristocrat, no doubt. probably 80 years old and dripping in dusty diamonds. It doesn't matter who she is. What matters is that we are there, and I am going to close the deal with Lord Harrington. Tonight isn't about the host, Isabella. It's about us." He was confident. He was arrogant. He was entirely unaware that the name Solara wasn't a family name. It was a reference to the sun, a symbol of rising from the darkness. Julian checked his Rolex. "Get ready. The car leaves at 7. Tonight we show the world what perfection looks like." The approach to Kensington Palace was a sea of flashing lights. The paparazzi were kept behind velvet ropes, a chaotic ocean of cameras and shouting voices. Black limousines and Rolls-Royces idled in a line, depositing the world's elite onto the red carpet. Inside the back of his Maybach, Julian adjusted his silk bow tie. He looked at Isabella. She was wearing the red McQueen dress, a structured, plunging gown that left very little to the imagination. It was bold, perhaps a bit too bold for a royal gala, but Julian liked the attention. He wanted to be seen. "Ready?" he asked. "Born ready," she purred, applying a final coat of crimson lipstick. The chauffeur opened the door, and the cool London air hit them, followed immediately by the blinding flash of strobes. Julian stepped out first, buttoning his jacket, then turned to offer his hand to Isabella. As she emerged, the cameras went wild. "Julian! Julian, over here! Is it true you're buying the Kensington estate? Isabella, who are you wearing?" Julian guided her down the carpet with a practiced hand on the small of her back. He waved stoically, projecting the image of a man who owned the pavement he walked on. Ahead of them, he spotted Lord Harrington, the man he needed to impress, speaking with a tall, elderly woman in emerald silk. Julian quickened his pace, steering Isabella towards them. "Lord Harrington," Julian boomed, extending a hand. "A pleasure to see you outside the boardroom." Harrington turned, his expression polite but cool. He adjusted his monocle, an affectation, but one he earned. "Ah, Mr. Vandemer. I see you received an invitation." I must admit, I was surprised. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Surprised?" "Vandemer Holdings is the leading tech conglomerate in the UK. I would think my presence is expected." "Of course," Harrington said, his eyes drifting briefly to Isabella's plunging neckline with a hint of distaste. "It's just that the Duchess is particular about her guest list. She usually favours those with philanthropic endeavours over aggressive acquisitions. I'm sure once I meet the Duchess, I can charm her into seeing the value of aggressive growth," Julian laughed, squeezing Isabella's waist. "Speaking of, where is our host?" Harrington pointed toward the massive oak doors leading into the orangery. "She is inside, preparing for the opening address. It is a masquerade of sorts tonight. Vandemer. Not of masks, but of revelations. I suggest you tread carefully. The Duchess values authenticity above all else." Julian watched Harrington walk away, annoyed. "Old fool," he muttered to Isabella. "He's just jealous I'm younger and richer." They entered the grand hall. It was breathtaking. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling, dripping with crystals. The room was filled with the scent of white roses, thousands of them, arranging in towering pillars. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters in white gloves moved silently with trays of vintage champagne. Julian took a glass and downed half of it. He scanned the room. He saw competitors, politicians, and celebrities. He felt a surge of power. He had won. He had divorced the dead weight of his past and ascended to this. "Julian," Isabella whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Look at that necklace." She was pointing to a display case in the center of the room. Inside sat a sapphire necklace that looked heavy enough to sink a ship. "The Star of Solara," Julian read the plaque. "Priceless. rumored to be a gift from the crown prince to his fiancée. I want one, Isabella whined playfully. Play your cards right, and I'll buy the mine that produces them, Julian bragged, loud enough for a nearby couple to hear. As they mingled, a hush began to fall over the room. The lights dimmed, casting a golden glow over the stage at the far end of the hall. The heavy velvet curtains began to sway. "Ladies and gentlemen," a herald's voice boomed, echoing off the marble walls. "Distinguished guests, please welcome your host for the evening, the fiancé of His Royal Highness Prince Alistair and the CEO of the Phoenix Foundation, Her Grace, the Duchess of Solara." Julian swirled his champagne, bored. Finally, let's see this old dowager. The curtains parted. There was no old woman. Standing center stage, bathed in a single spotlight, was a woman of breathtaking elegance. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged a silhouette Julian knew better than his own. It was off the shoulder, revealing skin that glowed like alabaster. Her hair, once mousy and kept in a messy bun, was now a cascade of rich, dark chocolate waves tumbling down her back, shining with health and vitality. Around her neck sat the real star of Solara, diamonds and sapphires that caught the light and threw it back in blinding fractals. She stood tall, radiating a cold, regal power that silenced the room instantly. Julian dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot, but he didn't hear it. He couldn't breathe. The room spun. Isabella looked at the mess, then at Julian. "Julian, what are you doing? Who is that?" Julian's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. He felt like he had been punched in the gut by a heavyweight boxer. He stared at the woman on stage, the woman commanding the attention of kings and lords. "It's not possible," he finally whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of horror and disbelief. That's Serafina." The shattering of the glass drew eyes. Heads turned toward Julian. Lord Harrington, the French ambassador, the CEO of rival firms. They looked at the spilled champagne, then at Julian's pale, slack-jawed face. It was a faux pas of the highest order, but Julian was paralyzed. On stage, Serafina didn't flinch. She must have heard the glass break. The acoustics in the orangery were perfect, but she didn't look down. Her eyes, painted with a smoky, alluring makeup that highlighted their amber depth, scanned the crowd with the poise of a queen surveying her subjects. "Welcome," she spoke into the microphone. Her voice. It was her voice, yet it wasn't. Gone was the timid, apologetic tone of the housewife who used to ask him if he wanted tea. This voice was rich, lower in pitch, cultivated and dripping with authority. 3 years ago, I stood in the rain with nothing. Tonight I stand before you to launch the Phoenix Foundation, an initiative dedicated to helping those who have been discarded to rebuild their lives. Isabella was frantically signaling a waiter to clean up the mess, embarrassed. "Julian, stop staring. Do you know her? Is she an ex-girlfriend or something?" "She's my ex-wife," Julian hissed, the words tasting like bile. Isabella froze. She looked back at the stage, analyzing the woman with critical, jealous eyes. "Her? That's the dowdy wife you told me about? The one who wore sweatpants and baked bread?" She was," Julian stammered. He couldn't reconcile the images. The Serafina he knew wore minimal makeup and bought clothes off the rack. This woman was wearing a gown that likely cost more than his first car, and the way she held herself, her chin lifted, her shoulders back, she looked dangerous. Serafina continued her speech, her gaze sweeping the room. "We often underestimate the strength of what we throw away. We discard people, ideas, and love, thinking they have no value. but pressure creates diamonds. And fire. She paused, a small knowing smile playing on her red lips. Fire creates phoenixes. For a split second, her eyes locked onto Julian's. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't a look of anger. It was worse. It was a look of total, amusing indifference. It was the look a human gives an insect before deciding it isn't even worth stepping on. Then she looked away, continuing her speech to thunderous applause. "I have to talk to her," Julian said, panic rising in his chest. His mind was racing. If she was the host, if she was the fiancée of Prince Alistair, she had power, massive power, and he had treated her like garbage. "Julian, don't," Isabella warned, clutching his arm. "She's the host. You can't just walk up to her." "Get off me," Julian snapped, shaking her off. "She's my wife, ex-wife. I know her. This has to be a joke, a setup." As the speech ended and the music resumed, a waltz, Serafina descended the stairs. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Prince Alistair, a man of 35 with the classic looks of a storybook royal and the sharp eyes of a military commander, met her at the bottom of the stairs. He took her hand, kissed it, and whispered something that made her laugh. A genuine, melodious laugh Julian hadn't heard in 5 years. Julian began to push through the crowd. He needed to re-establish dominance. He needed to prove that he was the one who made her, that she was nothing without him. It was a defense mechanism. His ego couldn't handle the reality that she had surpassed him. He breached the inner circle just as the prince stepped away to speak with a diplomat. Serafina stood alone for a moment, sipping sparkling water. "Serafina," Julian said, his voice loud, trying to sound authoritative, but sounding merely desperate. She turned slowly. Up close, she was even more flawless. Her skin was luminous. She smelled of jasmine and expensive oud wood, a far cry from the vanilla extract she used to smell like. She looked at him, her expression blank. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The insult landed like a slap. "Cut the act," Julian growled, stepping closer, invading her personal space. "It's me, Julian, your husband. What is this? Who are you trying to fool with this costume?" Serafina took a small sip of her water, her eyes dancing with amusement. "Mr. Vandermeer, I presume. I believe the term is ex-husband. And as for the costume..." She gestured to the room, to the palace, to the prince watching them from 10 feet away. "This is my life. It has been for quite some time. Though I suppose you were too busy with your associate to notice." She glanced past him to where Isabella was standing awkwardly in her loud red dress, looking out of place among the understated elegance of the aristocracy. "How?" Julian demanded, his face reddening. "I left you with nothing. I made sure of it. You had no degree, no money, no connections." "You left me with freedom, Julian," Serafina said, her voice dropping to a chill whisper. "And you forgot one thing. I was the one who edited your business proposals. I was the one who managed your network behind the scenes. I was the brain you took for granted. When you threw me out, I didn't cry. I went to work." "You're a fraud," Julian spat, realizing people were watching. "You're playing a role. Does the prince know? Does he know I found you in a library coffee shop in Leeds? Does he know you're damaged goods?" The air around them seemed to drop 10 degrees. Serafina didn't yell. She took one step forward, forcing Julian to step back. She leaned in, her lips close to his ear. "The prince knows everything, Julian. He knows about the affairs. He knows about the hidden offshore accounts you didn't declare during the divorce. He knows about the emotional abuse." She pulled back, her eyes hard as diamonds. "But most importantly," she said, raising her voice slightly, so the surrounding circle, including Lord Harrington, could hear. He knows that I am the one who advised the Titan Group to reconsider their merger with Vandermeer Holdings. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. What did you say? The merger, Serafina smiled, a terrifying, beautiful smile. It's dead, Julian. I killed it this morning. To understand the magnitude of Julian's collapse, one must understand the architecture of Serafina's rise. It was not a fairy tale transformation granted by a fairy godmother. It was a fortress built brick by bloody brick. 3 years ago, the night Julian kicked her out, Serafina Sterling didn't go to a hotel. She couldn't. Julian had cancelled her credit cards while she was packing her bag. She slept in her car, a 3-year-old sedan she had bought with her own savings, parked in a 24-hour Tesco lot on the outskirts of London. She cried until her eyes were swollen shut. But by dawn, the tears had stopped. Serafina realized something crucial in that cold car. Julian was right about one thing. She had made herself small to make him feel big. She had edited his speeches, balanced his books, and charmed his investors, all from the shadows, letting him take the credit because she thought that was what a good wife did. She drove to Heathrow and bought a one-way ticket to Vienna, using the last of her cash. She needed to be somewhere where the name Vandermeer meant nothing. Serafina had a degree in art history, a degree Julian had called useless. In Vienna, she walked into the prestigious Haus der Kunst auction house. She didn't apply for a job. She pointed out that a painting in their window, attributed to a 19th century imitator, was actually an early, unsigned work by Gustav Klimt. She was right. The discovery made the auction house €4 million. They hired her on the spot. For 2 years, she worked 18-hour days. She learned German, French, and Italian. She changed her style, not to attract men, but to armor herself. She traded floral prints for tailored blazers, passivity for assertiveness. She became the iron orchid of the European art world, beautiful, rare, and impossible to crush. She met Alistair one rainy afternoon in a dusty archive in Salzburg. He wasn't wearing a crown or a sash. He was wearing a wet trench coat and arguing with the archivist about the provenance of a medieval manuscript. "You're wrong," Serafina had said, not looking up from her own work. "The vellum is dated 1450, but the ink is clearly a 17th century iron gall mixture. It's a forgery." The man turned. He had piercing blue eyes and a jaw that looked carved from granite. "And who are you to correct a prince?" he asked, though there was a twinkle of amusement in his eye. "I'm the woman who knows more about ink than you," she countered. He didn't fire her. He didn't scold her. He laughed. He asked her for coffee. They talked for 5 hours, not about money or status, but about history, philosophy, and the burden of legacy. He introduced himself simply as Al. It wasn't until their 3rd date, when paparazzi swarmed them leaving a jazz club, that she realized who he was. His Royal Highness, Prince Alistair of Valoria, 3rd in line to the throne of one of Europe's wealthiest distinct principalities. When she tried to break it off, terrified of the spotlight, Alistair refused. "I don't care about your past," he had told her in his chalet in the Swiss Alps, holding her face in his hands. "I care about your mind. You are the only person who treats me like a man, not a title." She told him everything. The divorce, Julian, the humiliation. Alistair hadn't been angry at her. He was furious for her. "He didn't just lose a wife," Alistair had said darkly. "He threw away a queen. One day, Serafina, we will make him see exactly what he lost." And so, the plan for the Sapphire Gala was born. It wasn't just a party, It was a stage play, and Julian Vandemer had unknowingly walked into the final act. Back in the orangery, the air was thick with tension. Julian Vandemer stood frozen, the words, "The merger is dead," ringing in his ears like a funeral toll. "You're lying," Julian whispered, his face draining of color. "You can't kill the Titan merger. That deal has been in the works for 8 months. Lord Harrington values integrity," Serafina interrupted, her voice cool and carrying effortlessly over the string quartet. "He values stability. When I showed him the forensic accounting of how you funneled company assets into your mistress's lifestyle under the guise of consulting fees, he found you unstable." Isabella, standing next to Julian, suddenly looked very small in her loud red dress. "Julian, what is she talking about? What fees?" Julian spun around to face the room. He needed to find Harrington. He needed to fix this. He saw the Lord standing near a pillar, studiously examining a painting. "Harrington!" Julian shouted, forgetting all protocol. He shoved past a waiter, nearly knocking a tray of caviar to the floor. "Harrington, look at me!" The room went silent. The music stopped. Lord Harrington turned slowly. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was far worse in these circles. "Mr. Vandemer, I believe I made my position clear earlier. The Titan Group does not do business with men who treat their finances and their families with such reckless abandon." "You listened to her?" Julian pointed a shaking finger back at Serafina. "She's a scorned ex-wife. She's vindictive. She's manipulating you. She is the future Princess of Valoria." A deep, baritone voice cut through the air. Prince Alistair stepped forward, placing a protective hand on the small of Serafina's back. He didn't shout, but his voice commanded absolute silence. He looked at Julian with the kind of disdain a lion reserves for a hyena. "And," the prince continued, "she is the most brilliant financial strategist I have ever met. She didn't manipulate anyone, Vandemer. She simply handed over the files you thought were hidden. You really should update your cybersecurity." Julian felt the walls closing in. He looked around the room. People he had known for years, CEOs, bankers, socialites, were averting their gaze. They weren't just looking away, they were physically turning their backs to him. It was the social death, a punishment more severe in high society than a physical beating. He was being erased in real time. "Come on, Julian," Isabella hissed, grabbing his arm. Her nails dug into his suit fabric. "Let's go. Everyone is staring. This is humiliating." "No!" Julian snapped, ripping his arm away. His narcissism wouldn't let him flee. He couldn't leave as the loser. He had to win. He had to show them he was still powerful. "You think you can ruin me?" Julian laughed, manically, adjusting his tie. "I am Vandemer Holdings. I am worth billions. I don't need the Titan merger. I don't need any of you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'll buy my way out of this. I'll buy this whole damn building if I want to." Serafina watched him with a pitying expression. "Check your phone, Julian." "What?" "Check your phone." Julian unlocked his screen. There were 42 missed calls, 30 from his CFO, 10 from his legal team, 2 from the Financial Conduct Authority. He opened his banking app. His face went grey. "Why are my accounts frozen?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Because," Serafina said, stepping down one step so she was eye level with him. "When the Titan deal fell through an hour ago, it triggered a margin call on the loans you took out to leverage the deal. And since the collateral for those loans was your stock, which has plummeted 40% in after-hours trading since the news leaked." "I'm broke," Julian choked out. "Liquidity crisis," Prince Alistair corrected smoothly. "Though, effectively, yes. You are currently trespassing at a charity gala you can no longer afford to attend." The humiliation was total. Julian looked at Isabella, his trophy, his prize. Isabella was looking at her own phone. She looked up at him, her eyes cold. Is it true? Is the money gone? It's a glitch, Julian lied, sweating profusely. I'll fix it. Bella, baby, we're fine. Isabella laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. We? There is no we if there's no money, Julian. I didn't sign up to be a nursemaid to a bankrupt fraud. She turned to Serafina. Your Grace, she said, dropping a clumsy curtsy. I had no idea. He told me you were crazy. He lied to me too. Get out, Julian roared at Isabella. You ungrateful gold-digging. Mr. Vandemer, the prince interrupted, snapping his fingers. Two large men in discreet suits materialized from the shadows. Royal security. You are upsetting the Duchess, Alistair said calmly. And you are upsetting the guests. I think it is time for you to leave. You can't throw me out, Julian screamed. I am Julian Vandemer. You are a trespasser, the prince said. Escort him out. The lady can stay if she wishes to apologize, but he goes. The guards moved in. One took Julian's left arm, the other his right. He struggled, his expensive shoes skidding on the marble floor. Serafina! He screamed as they dragged him backward. Serafina, tell them to stop. I'm your husband. We had a life. Serafina! Serafina didn't look at him. She turned to the conductor of the orchestra and gave a subtle nod. The music swelled, a triumphant, soaring crescendo of Mozart. As Julian was hauled toward the massive oak doors, kicking and screaming like a petulant child, he saw the final image that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw Serafina laughing. Not at him. She wasn't even looking at him anymore. She was looking at Prince Alistair, who was whispering something in her ear. She looked radiant, powerful, and free. She looked like a queen. The doors slammed shut, severing him from the light, the warmth, and the life he had thrown away. Outside, it had started to rain again. The paparazzi, sensing blood in the water, turned their cameras away from the celebrities arriving and toward the man being thrown out. Julian Vandemer landed on the wet pavement of the Kensington driveway, his tuxedo muddy, his reputation in tatters. He looked up, expecting his Maybach. It wasn't there. The driver, unpaid for 2 months, had likely driven off the moment the news broke. He was alone. But the story wasn't over. Julian Vandemer was a man who had clawed his way to the top once. He wouldn't accept defeat this easily. As he sat in the mud, humiliated, a dark, desperate rage began to boil in his gut. If he couldn't have his life back, he would make sure Serafina didn't get to keep hers. He reached for his phone to call the one person he knew would help him burn it all down. A tabloid journalist known as the Butcher of Fleet Street. Hello? Julian rasped into the phone, rain dripping down his nose. I have a story. About the future princess. It's a lie, all of it. And I have the pictures to prove it. Marcus Thorne did not have an office. He had a lair. It was a basement suite in Soho that smelled of stale tobacco and printer ink. Known as the Butcher, Thorne had destroyed more careers than the stock market crash. He didn't care about truth. He cared about clicks. Julian sat across from him, shivering in his damp tuxedo. He looked manic. I have photos, Julian said, sliding a manila envelope across the scarred wooden desk. From before, when she was unstable. Thorne opened the envelope with a nicotine-stained finger. Inside were photos of Serafina from 3 years ago. In one, she was crying on the floor of their kitchen, surrounded by broken dishes Julian had thrown. In another, she looked disheveled, wearing baggy clothes, her eyes dark with exhaustion. She looks like a junkie, Thorne grunted, interested. She was, Julian lied, his eyes wide. Depression pills, anxiety meds. She couldn't handle the pressure of being a CEO's wife. I had to carry her. I paid for everything. And now she claims she was the brains? She was a charity case, Thorne. A mental case. If she marries Prince Alistair, she'll destabilize the monarchy. Thorne grinned, revealing yellow teeth. The Mad Duchess. I like it. Front page tomorrow? I want exclusivity, Julian demanded, feeling a surge of his old arrogance returning. And I want payment. £50,000. Done, Thorne said. The next morning, London woke up to a scandal. The tabloids screamed in bold red font, "From bag lady to royalty, the secret mental breakdown of the future princess." Julian sat in a cheap hotel room, scrolling through the comments on his phone. They were vicious. People were calling Serafina a fraud, a gold digger, a liability. He laughed, eating a cold sandwich. He had won. He had tainted her perfection. Prince Alistair couldn't marry a liability, but Julian had forgotten the one rule Serafina had mentioned at the gala. Pressure creates diamonds. At 2:00 p.m., a press conference was called at Kensington Palace. Julian turned on the TV, expecting to see a cancellation of the engagement. Instead, he saw Serafina. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't wearing sunglasses. She stood at a podium, flanked by Prince Alistair on one side and the director of a mental health charity on the other. She looked directly into the camera lens, and Julian felt a chill crawl up his spine. "This morning," Serafina began, her voice steady. "Images were leaked of me from 3 years ago. My ex-husband, Mr. Vandemer, claims these photos show a woman who was mentally unstable." She paused, taking a deep breath. "He is right. I was unstable. I was broken. Because for 5 years, I lived in a home where my self-worth was systematically dismantled. The woman you see in those photos isn't a drug addict. She is a survivor of domestic emotional abuse." The camera flashed blindingly. "I am not ashamed of those photos," Serafina declared, her voice rising with power. "They are my battle scars. They show where I started. And standing here today, as a woman who rebuilt herself from that floor, I am telling every woman watching, you are not defined by the man who broke you. You are defined by how you rebuild." Prince Alistair stepped forward, his face dark with fury. "We have also released the full police report from the night of their separation, along with the medical records indicating Mr. Vandemer's accidental injury to her arm." Julian dropped his sandwich. The medical records. He had bribed the doctor to keep those quiet. How did they find them? "Furthermore," Alistair continued, "the palace is pressing charges against Marcus Thorne for libel, and against Julian Vandemer for blackmail and violation of a non-disclosure agreement. The payment Mr. Vandemer received from the tabloid has been traced. It is a criminal act." The feed cut to a reporter outside Julian's hotel. "Police are currently moving to arrest disgraced CEO Julian Vandemer." Julian heard the sirens before he saw them. He ran to the window. Blue lights flashed against the rain-slicked glass. They weren't coming to interview him. They were coming to take him away. He had tried to bury her, but he didn't realize she was a seed. And now, the dirt he threw was only helping her grow, while he was being buried alive. The downfall of Julian Vandemer did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the high-definition glare of the public eye. The trial at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, was less a legal proceeding and more a public flaying. Julian stood in the dock, encased in bulletproof glass, wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big. He had lost 20 pounds in the 3 weeks since his arrest. The charge list was long: blackmail, extortion, violation of the Computer Misuse Act, and perjury, but the legal charges were nothing compared to the social indictment. The star witness for the prosecution had been the final nail in his coffin: Isabella. She had walked into the courtroom wearing a modest black dress, her platinum hair dyed a sensible brunette, playing the role of the manipulated victim to perfection. She testified that Julian had forced her to pose as his fiancée, that he had coerced her into spending the company money, and that he was obsessed with ruining his ex-wife. It was all lies. Isabella had spent the money with glee, but the jury didn't care. They hated Julian. He was the villain of the year. When the gavel fell, the sentence was 5 years in HMP Wandsworth for financial fraud and blackmail. As the guards handcuffed him, Julian looked back at the gallery, searching for a friendly face. There were none. Lord Harrington was there, shaking his head. His former board members were there, looking relieved he was gone. But Serafina was not there. She hadn't even dignified his trial with her presence. The morning of the royal wedding dawned with a sky the colour of a robin's egg, a rare, perfect blue over London. The city was vibrating. Millions of people lined the streets from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey. Flags waved in a chaotic sea of red, white and blue, interspersed with the gold and emerald banners of the Phoenix Foundation. Inside cell 42 on the G-wing of Wandsworth Prison, the sky was just a sliver of light through a barred window high on the wall. The air smelled of industrial disinfectant, unwashed bodies, and damp concrete. Julian sat on the edge of his bunk. His head was shaved, a precaution against lice, and the sharp, handsome features that had once graced the cover of Forbes were now gaunt and hollow. He wore grey sweat pants and a jumper that itched. "Oi, Vandemer!" a voice shouted from the corridor. It was Biggs, a hulking man serving time for armed robbery, who had taken a twisted liking to tormenting the fallen CEO. "Get your posh ass out here. It's starting. Your missus is on the telly." Julian didn't want to move. He wanted to curl into a ball and sleep until the 5 years were up. But in prison, refusal was not an option. He stood up, his joints popping, and walked slowly into the Common Association room. It was packed. Inmates were crowded around the small, wall-mounted television, jeering and laughing. It was the only channel allowed today. The governor of the prison had deemed it a historic national event. For Julian, it was a televised execution of his soul. On the screen, the camera swept over the mall. The crowds were roaring, a sound like continuous thunder. The commentator's voice, crisp and British, filled the room. "It is a glorious day for the monarchy, and indeed for the country. We are awaiting the arrival of the bride, Miss Serafina Sterling, soon to be Her Royal Highness. The excitement is palpable. It is a fairy tale come true, a woman who rose from hardship to capture the heart of the people's prince." Julian leaned against the back wall, crossing his arms to hide the shaking of his hands. "Look at that car," Biggs whistled, pointing at the screen. A vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom 4, the glasshouse model, was slowly making its way through the cheering throngs. Inside, visible to the world, sat Serafina. Julian felt the breath leave his lungs. She was wearing a gown designed by Sarah Burton for Alexander McQueen, a breathtaking creation of ivory silk crepe and satin gazelle. The bodice was hand-embroidered with English roses and the mythical phoenix, a subtle nod to her foundation. But it was her face that destroyed him. She wasn't looking down demurely. She was waving, smiling, her eyes bright and alive. She looked victorious. Not in a vindictive way, but in a way that suggested she had completely forgotten the darkness that came before. She looked like she had never been broken. "She's a looker, ain't she, Julian?" a younger inmate sneered, nudging him. "How'd you fumble that bag, mate?" Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was closed tight. He remembered the last time he saw her in a car. It was the day he kicked her out. She was driving her beat-up Ford, crying so hard she could barely see the road. He had watched from the window, sipping scotch, feeling powerful. How? He thought, the word looping in his mind like a curse. How did she do it? Westminster Abbey. The interior of the abbey was a sanctuary of golden light and soaring stone arches. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax. Kings, queens, sultans, and presidents filled the pews. Prince Alistair stood at the altar, dressed in the full ceremonial uniform of the Royal Dragoon Guards, the scarlet tunic stark against the stone. He did not look like a stiff, duty-bound royal. He looked like a man who was struggling to contain an explosion of joy. He kept glancing at the great west door, shifting his weight, his famous composure cracking. As the first notes of Handel's Zadok the priest rang out, the congregation rose. Serafina began her walk. She walked alone for the first half of the aisle, a break from tradition that she had insisted on. It was a statement, "I come to this marriage on my own 2 feet." Halfway down the aisle, her father did not meet her. He had passed away years ago. Instead, the king himself stepped out from the side. A gasp went through the abbey and through the billions watching at home. The king offered his arm to Serafina. It was the ultimate seal of approval, the ultimate rejection of anyone who had ever doubted her worth. In the prison common room, the silence was heavy. Even the hardest criminals were watching, captivated by the sheer spectacle of it. "The king," someone whispered. "Blimey, the king is walking her." Julian felt a tear slide down his cheek. He wiped it away angrily, terrified anyone would see. He remembered telling Serafina she was common. He remembered telling her she would never fit in his world. And now, the monarch of England was escorting her to the altar, while Julian rotted in a cage. The camera zoomed in on Serafina's face as she reached Alistair. The prince didn't wait for the protocol. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tight. He whispered something to her that the microphones didn't catch, but the lip readers would later confirm. He said, "You are the only truth I know." Julian squeezed his eyes shut. He remembered his own wedding to Serafina. It had been a small registry office affair because he didn't want to spend money on it. He had taken a call from a client during the reception dinner. He had never told her she was beautiful that day. He had told her the dress made her look a bit wide. Regret, cold and sharp as a knife, twisted in his gut. It wasn't just that he had lost the money. It wasn't just that he was in prison. It was the sudden, horrifying realization that he had held a diamond in his hand and thrown it into the mud because he was too blind to see it shine. He had spent his life chasing more money, younger women, higher status. And in front of him, on a grainy 24-inch screen, was the embodiment of everything he had actually needed: loyalty, intelligence, and grace. The vows. The Archbishop of Canterbury, his voice resonating through the vast history of the abbey, began the vows. "Alistair Edward James, will you take Serafina Marie?" "I will," Alistair said, his voice booming without hesitation. "And will you, Serafina Marie, take Alistair?" The camera held on Serafina. For a split second, her eyes seemed to drift upward, looking at the stained glass, looking at the light. "I will," she said. Her voice was different than the one Julian knew. It was lower, anchored in certainty. "Who gives this woman?" the Archbishop asked. "She gives herself, with the blessing of the crown," the king replied. Julian felt like he couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. The contrast was too much. The beauty on the screen versus the squalor of his reality. The love in their eyes versus the hatred directed at him from the world. He stood up abruptly. "Sit down, Vandemer," Biggs barked. "They're doing the rings." "I can't," Julian rasped. I'm sick." He pushed past the inmates, ignoring their jeers and curses. He stumbled out into the corridor, leaning against the cold brick wall, gasping for air. He slid down until he hit the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. From the room, he could still hear the television. "I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." A roar went up, both from the Abbey on the TV and from the prisoners inside the room. It was a sound of universal celebration. Julian put his hands over his ears. He pressed hard, trying to block it out. But he couldn't block out the memory. He remembered the night he came home late, smelling of Isabella's perfume. Serafina had been waiting up with dinner. She had looked at him, knowing, and asked, "Why, Julian? Am I not enough?" And he had looked her in the eye and said, "You're nothing, Serafina. You're just background noise." Now, she was the melody the whole world was singing, and he was the silence. The balcony. An hour later, the scene shifted to Buckingham Palace. The mall was a solid wall of people. The royal family stepped out onto the balcony. The noise was deafening. Fighter jets roared overhead, leaving trails of red, white, and blue smoke. Serafina stood next to Alistair. She waved the sapphire engagement ring, the ring that had started the nightmare for Julian, glinting in the sun. She looked out over the sea of faces. She saw the signs. "We love Serafina, the Phoenix Princess." In that moment, Serafina did think of the past. But she didn't think of Julian. She didn't think of the insults or the lonely nights. She thought of the girl sleeping in the car in the Tesco parking lot. She thought of the cold fear in her stomach that night. She mentally reached back to that girl, grabbed her hand, and pulled her onto the balcony. "We made it," she thought. "We survived." She turned to Alistair. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. "For what?" He smiled. "For the work," she said, her eyes serious. "The foundation, the policies. We have a lot to do." Alistair kissed her hand. "With you, I'm ready for anything." The end of the line. Back in Wandsworth, the television was finally turned off. The inmates dispersed for the afternoon count. Julian sat in his cell. The silence was absolute. He looked at the small metal table bolted to the floor. On it sat a single letter. It had arrived yesterday, but he hadn't opened it. The return address was embossed with a silver crest, the Phoenix Foundation. His hands trembling, he tore it open. There was no money inside, no gloating, no pictures of the wedding. It was a single sheet of cream paper, the same high quality as the invitation that had started this mess. It read, "Julian, I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, and not because you asked for it, but because my future is too bright to carry the weight of hating you. You told me once that I was nothing without your money. I hope, in the silence of your cell, you finally understand. Money is just paper. Character is currency, and you are bankrupt. Do not write to me. Do not look for me. I am gone. Serafina." Julian stared at the letter. "I forgive you." It was the ultimate power move. If she had been angry, it would have meant he still mattered. If she had hated him, it would have meant he still had a hold on her. But forgiveness? Indifference? That was erasure. She had scraped him off her shoe and kept walking. He crushed the letter in his fist. A sob broke from his chest, a jagged, ugly sound. He wasn't crying for her. He was crying because he knew, with terrifying clarity, that the rest of his life would be nothing but a footnote in her biography. He lay back on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. The sun had moved, and the sliver of light in his cell was gone. It was dark now, and in the darkness, Julian Vandemer finally disappeared. Character is currency, and you are bankrupt. That might be the most brutal line Serafina ever delivered, and she didn't even have to say it to his face. The story of Julian and Serafina proves that the best revenge isn't anger, it's absolute, undeniable success. Serafina didn't just survive, she evolved. She turned her pain into a crown and wore it for the world to see. I want to know what you guys think about that ending. Did Julian deserve the letter, or should Serafina have just ignored him completely? Was 5 years in prison enough for what he did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I love reading your theories and reactions. If this story gave you chills, please smash that like button and share it with a friend who needs a reminder of their own worth. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. I have an even crazier story coming next week, involving a billionaire, a secret heir, and a betraying best friend that you do not want to miss. Thank you for watching, and remember, your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see your worth. See you in the next one.